Good afternoon and welcome to the latest edition of Cult Classic Movies. This week we're going into the bank vault and we're going back in time. In fact, we're going back more than 35 years really back in time to the action smash hit blockbuster, the film that put Arnold Schwarzenegger on the map, Commando, back in 1985. And we're delighted yet again to have another cast member of this cult classic movie with us this evening, the one and only David Patrick Kelly, who we all remember played the role of Sully in Commando in 1985. And David, first of all, 1985, probably 1984, when you're on the set, probably filming for Commando. Does it almost feel like it's been 35 years? How the memory's holding up?
Oh, it's doing good. It's doing good. It's something about show business because you're like in a time capsule. When you make these things, it's so intense because you slow time down so much because you're going over and over. Even if you're on a relatively low budget like Commando was, they still, time is compressed. So you go over and over, take a few takes, and so it becomes deeply impressed on you. And so the work that you do, to prepare for it and everything else becomes deeply impressed on you. So the memories can be vivid, we'll see. But, I remember quite a bit and the impression that it made on me,
I suppose that, David, in terms of Commando back in 1985, I suppose you were right in saying it was a low sort of budget production for the time. It was up and coming stars. I suppose, in fairness, when you look at it yourself and probably Bill Duke were probably the two most established stars on that set of that sort of movie at that sort of time. So what was your sort of take when you heard this sort of bodybuilding Austrian was going to be playing the main role sort of in Commando, this sort of weightlifter in terms of that? Were you sort of saying, who is this guy?
No, we were impressed. Everybody was starting to lift weights then. You even remember Bruce Springsteen and everybody was in the 80s. You had, Flashdance, and you had all the people were working out a lot, and I just bought in a home gym, and I talked to Arnold about it. It was called a solo flex, and he said, yes, they're very good if you can't get to the gym, and so, I was impressed by Arnold, and he'd already done Conan the Barbarian, hadn't he? Or was it, so he wanted to do something much more human. And so, when D'Souza wrote it, they were trying to humanize Arnold, and make him just a regular guy. And we were going to be the crazy people around the outside of it, And so I had a very nice time working with Arnold. I met his mother and his childhood best friend, and he was very humble about his acting skills. And those of us who'd been on stage for a long time, as I had, and done a few films, Commando was my same team from 48 Hours and from The Warriors, Larry Gordon and Joel Silver. And so Arnold was very impressive to me. He would come in, he'd seen the dailies, and he'd watch them and he'd give compliments about, acting technique and how he was learning about acting technique. And so, I had a great deal of respect for him. And it's not easy to be, Mr. World Champion. That's quite impressive as well. And he was a businessman. He had a vitamin business and all this stuff, So there was much stuff to be impressed by Arnold, and he was carrying the movie. So it's great to be in a movie with somebody who's an action star,
I suppose, David, I just want to put this point to you because it sort of stuck in my head that the last person of the cast member I spoke to was Rae Dawn Chong, who played the character Cindy, and she told
she's great.
She told me she felt that there was an awful lot of male testosterone in the show, that it was a male sort of driven show. Would you sort of agree or disagree with that comment? Do you think it's a bit harsh?
Well, I think so. She brought the kind of Carol Lombard comedic energy to it that it needed because we had the great stuntmen and a lot of people doing that had a whole history of doing wonderful action movies. So everybody was kind of pumped up, and Arnold was doing special kind of martial arts training that so he could bring that to the movie. And so yeah, she's right, but it wouldn't be anything without her. She really did a wonderful job in doing exactly what I was talking about, humanizing Arnold. And so, yeah, she took the edge off us real well.
And David, were you one of the first members cast for the movie Commando for that role as Sully? Were you brought on early on in the sort of project?
Well, as I say, I didn't have to audition or anything because they were my people, Joel Silver and Lawrence Gordon. Hope my voice is all right. And so I didn't have to audition, and they just brought me out to LA to do it, and I think I was early on thought of for that. Sullivan. I don't know if you know this. This is a first time reveal. Stands for, I mean, Sully stands for Sullivan. So I think they might have been thinking of me then, but yeah, early on they called me up.
And I suppose, David, in terms of Commandos, the sort of filming itself and being on set and sort of shooting alongside the likes of Vernon Wells and Bill Duke, you assembled a really good sort of cast around sort of Arnold as well. And did you get the sense coming off the movie when you saw the final sort of product? Because you've been around the block for a while, you know a good thing when you see it. Did you think to yourself, yeah, we've done really good with this movie? There's a chance that this movie could, even after its release, it could still grab the public's attention?
Well, I've always been able to learn from people like Lawrence Gordon and Joel Silver, and they really know the architecture of action movies. They call it the beats. And I remember Joel Silver talking very much about how they'd worked really hard on the beats of the action sequences in the movie. And so, I've always been an action fan from early on, and to see those great stunt people doing it, you remember the famous sequence when Arnold is chasing me through the shopping mall, and he's evading all the police, and he has to swing down onto an elevator and catch me. And that was done by, I think the stunt guy was not much taller than I am. I'm 5'4", and he was the double for Arnold. He was 62 at the time, and he did it in 2 takes. He just jumped on a rope with a bunch of balloons on it and swang through the shopping mall, the Sherman Oaks Galleria, and jumped on the top of that elevator. And, so that kind of stuff, when you see it for the first time, you see how it works. It's fun being on set to see it, but when you see the great cinematography, and what they've done, you can tell, and you could tell that it was an exciting thing. Plus the score, from the great James Horner. Now, that was a team that was also brought over from 48 Hours, which we'd done a year or two before that. And he had his trademark steel drums in there. And he had some great LA session players, great people. Ernie Watts was a saxophone player. Ernie Watts was a saxophone player who played with the Rolling Stones and on and on. So that signature sound, when you see the rough cut of the movie, you can't tell without that kind of unifying sound of the score, and James Horner's trademark score, which won the award from the LA critics for that score, was great, So, it's magic the way that all comes together.
In terms of Sully, my take of him was a guy that had probably the weight of the world on his shoulders in terms of trying to be successful and make his way in the world, but also fearful that at any moment that he's back, someone could knife him in the back. He was that sort of conscious guy. He looked to me that he was probably the weight of the world. He looked very sort of stressful type of guy that was just felt almost all the time that he was in a battle, maybe a physical sort of a battle, just in terms of his own survival and to make ends meet and to progress. He was an ambitious type of guy that wanted to move up the ladders fairly quickly.
Now, are we talking about Sully?
Sully, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, the way that came about, the way I researched it, was there were some mercenary people. And this is the important why Commando, cartoon as it is still relevant, is because of all the Commando armies that are around now, all the mercenary armies. Now, I'd seen a news program that had two mercenaries, people that were in the US military, who had hired themselves out after they retired to protect like these gangster kind of people in different island countries. And they were very well trained. And you can choose your favorite, you know, example of it today. You know, all these different armies that are around in the world that are just made up of mercenary armies, you know, that are protecting people and protecting the resources in the world. So, you know, I'd seen these two guys. And so when the late Charles Mishak, who was my partner when we took Arnold to the airport, there was Charles Mishak, and Enriquez was his character's name. And he was an actual Vietnam veteran. And just when we were filming that in the LA airport, they finally had a parade in downtown Manhattan for all the Vietnam veterans. This was 1984. And he was so moved watching this on the televisions at the airport when we were filming it, that he just couldn't speak. He was really, you know, because these people had come home in the late 60s and early 70s, and they were spat upon, you know, because they were drafted and they went to Vietnam and they were, you know, doing their job, you know, and so Charles Mishak, he passed away about 10 years ago. It was very interesting to be partnered up with him in that movie, and on and on. I mean, there's the research that I read for that movie was a book by Christopher Dickey. Now, Christopher Dickey was one of the founders of the Daily Beast. I don't know if you've read that news organization, but he was the son of a poet laureate in the US, James Dickey, who wrote Deliverance with Burt Reynolds, and he wrote that original novel. But he was the poet laureate under Jimmy Carter because he was from the South, from Georgia. And his son, Christopher Dickey, was an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. He wrote a book called With the Contras. He went down to Nicaragua and he was embedded with the Contras against the Sandinistas. And I read his book, and he had a CIA manual about counter-revolutionary activity. And so I brought that to Joel, and that was influenced on the costumes and the things in Commando. And that informed my character of Sully, this kind of mercenary, maybe CIA guy who was working, you know, both sides of the fence way back when, you know.
And you sort of, David, you sort of took on the sort of trends back on the 80s. I suppose in the 80s, there was an awful lot of conflict in terms of communism. There was the Falklands War as well. You had those sort of, those Eastern European sort of states where rogue dictators were trying to stay in power. Even in the, obviously back in the Cold War days, you had Cuba and you had Castro. So it's very something that that was only in recent sort of history, and that people were very intrigued by watching on the news. People are very into CNN to see all these sort of things going on, these coups and these sort of rebellions and stuff. So Commando got this sort of influence in terms of those sort of teams with the Arius, Dan Heda's character, trying to organize this sort of a coup as well. So you played into topics that were very relevant at the time as well in the 80s.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I always say about Commando that Arnold, he's a Republican. I'm an old school Kennedy Democrat. You know, I saw John Kennedy and I saw Robert Kennedy speak, you know, in the still to this day, we got a new administration. But Arnold, he's a different kind. He's an old school Republican, and in the 80s, he was what I call the Reagan id monster. He was sort of what every red-blooded Reagan era person wanted to be, the fighting for the right, and fighting against, socialist takeovers and things like that, he sort of fulfilled that, in a big way with that movie, especially. There were others around. He was vying with Sylvester Stallone for who was going to be the guy that represented the person who's fighting for the right, who has the guts to do it alone. And, if there's no one else, I'm going to do it all myself, so it was that kind of feeling, that was around at the time. And so it was fun to sort of represent the brutal kind of, amoral aspect of that, which Sully certainly was. One of the worst villains I've ever played, really horrible person, playing both sides of the fence and, doing it all for the money, and horribly cruel and crude. So it was an interesting story to tell, and to research and to be with all those good actors there,
It sort of intrigued me, and one of the most things, your death scene is iconic. It's probably legendary. The sentences where I said, where he goes, I said, I kill you last, I lied, and sort of stuff like that. It's legendary, but it probably stands to everybody sort of remembers that sort of sequence in your death scene. But the part where he's you hanging off a sort of a cliff, in terms of your sort of stunt, sort of double, and the time that you're talking, that were you sort of suspended yourself, or how did that sort of sequence, because obviously you're talking up at him at certain stages as well. So I was just intrigued by the actual shooting of that sort of scene as well, because it's very iconic in terms of a death scene sort of stuff. And normally you see death scenes where it's very much a stuntman is very much in patrol, but you could be seen hanging upside down, talking back at him and sort of stage. So I was just sort of intrigued, where was it stationed? Was there a bit of a drop underneath you?
There was, and there were the late great Benny Dobbins was the stunt coordinator on that. He was in charge of all the stunts, and he was a old, you've seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, so the kind of legends about stuntmen. Well, Benny was actually one of those stuntmen, and he was a really tough old guy, and he gave me his personal stuntman's belt that had a long leather strap on it, and they hooked me up to a big crane, and they erased that with their primitive special effects in the film, but I was on a big crane, so Arnold only had to look like he was holding me there. And Benny was a cowboy stuntman back in the 50s, where they'd pull him off his horse when he got shot and stuff like that with that belt. And so that's what I was wearing. That's how that went. And we filmed it up at the Griffith Observatory. Now, as a film expert, you probably remember Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean and Dennis Hopper. You haven't seen it? You haven't seen it?
I haven't seen it. I've heard of it. Yeah.
Oh my God, you're too young. You're just proving you're too young. Rebel Without a Cause, directed by the great Nick Ray, and James Dean and Sal Mineo and Natalie Wood are in that. Oh man. And so they have a knife fight at the Griffith Observatory. And so I was thrilled as a relatively young actor to be there at the place where James Dean had made this iconic movie as well. So out there in Hollywood, it's layer on layer of different movies, that are made in similar places, So that's part of what happened there at the when he dropped me off the cliff. And it also reminds me of a kind of Charlie Chaplin sequence, where I'm, in a horrible, precarious situation. And, so I could use all my Chaplin training, mime skills, that for that sequence.
And just in terms of that observer, was it a 10-foot drop underneath you in terms of the drop? In terms of as an actor,
Well,
I suppose, and were you fully when you saw that in the script there at the time, where you be hanging? Were you like, hold on a second, or were you sort of very comfortable with it?
no, young and foolish, and it was quite steep. It was like this. And here we are up here, and right just about 10 feet under here was Benny and another stunt guy. And down here is a long rolling hill down to the bottom down there, So,
Right.
it was dicey, but controlled.
And I suppose, David, in terms of Commando, I suppose as the crew started when you finish up the movie and you went for the screening, uh, you went for the screening of the movie. Were you sort of, what was your expectations? Did you think to yourself, this is going to be an action movie that probably takes in a good bit of numbers at the box office? It'd be relevant maybe for maybe a month, maybe 2 months at most, and like other projects might disappear, or were you sort of surprised in very, very much sense that maybe after the initial sort of take that Commandos seem to stay relevant, even 2 or 3 years after its release, and I suppose its growth probably grew as the years went on.
Well, Mr. D'Souza wrote the screenplay after the horrible tragedy of 9/11, was invited to a commission to advise the military about possible scenarios of what terrorists were going to be thinking. Now, we played sort of terrorists in that movie. And so D'Souza was asked to come up with ideas of what could possibly happen. What we should be, now they call it gaming. You game it out so you know what could possibly happen in an unusual situation, in an unpredictable situation. And so I think what was happening in the 80s and in the late 70s, my eyes were opened with the Warriors, because when I read the script for the Warriors, I said, well, it's like a Roger Corman movie. It's like a genre film that I used to see at drive-in movie theaters, But it was number one. The Warriors was number one. So it was the beginning of this mixing that Tarantino now does so well, of art films and action movies. Before, you'd go down to 42nd Street in New York, and there would be Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson on one side of the street, and there would be Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep and movies by Bergman on the other side of the street. And you never had that mix. There were two different audiences. Now they all became blended. And this was the beginning of it. Films like The Warriors and 48 Hours and Commando were the beginning of this mixture. And then everybody wanted to be in action movies, after that. There was a much more of a blend of action movies and higher sensibilities, of what could be, what kind of a story would be interesting for people. If you go back to Aristotle in his Poetics about drama said what people want to see is dead bodies, and they want to learn something. That's what he said in his great book, The Poetics, dead bodies and to learn something. And so it's like a detective story, and in much of the Greek drama that he was talking about, that's what you see, and you learn something. Of course, there's a few good words that he throws in there too that makes it a little bit more transcendent. But, what are you going to say about I lied? That's got a poetry of its own, doesn't it?
It does very much, David. I suppose, David, the last sort of question before I let you go on, probably the hardest one in terms of finish off these sort of interviews on. If someone put your character, Sully, in terms of bad guys, and they put him into a sort of a bad guy sort of encyclopedia, a dictionary as such, and they left two blank sentences underneath, and they asked you, David Patrick Kelly, having played the role of Sully, summarize him up. What would you like those two, if you had to write those two sentences, what would you like those two sentences to read?
Sully represented the negative in the world that makes the positive worth fighting for.
Wow. That is a golden one. That's only one sentence I'd say, and you're not going to get much better than that.
So,
David, you did it in one. You're the first person I've known that has probably done it in one sentence alone. Most people spin off paragraphs or reels if you could try and ask them to keep within the. But David Patrick Kelly, an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
Great pleasure.
Live your memories in Sully back in the 1985 smash hit blockbuster action movie Commando. David, it's great to see you're still in great nick as always, and we wish you a prosperous 2021, and hopefully another movie, please God, might be on the cards and we might get to see you again.
Yeah, you can see two. There's one called Fugitive Dreams, and there's one called an action movie, VFW, which stands, it's the old soldiers go to these bars and they call them Veterans of Foreign Wars. VFW, that's the name of it. Two good ones.
We'll no doubt we'll check them out, David. But for the moment, stay safe and stay well, and enjoy the warmth of your home surroundings.
You too, brother. Thank you so much.
Do you think that he is going to give us any problems?
He'll do exactly as he's told.
Hasta luego, fellas.
You're a funny guy, Sully. That's why I'm going to kill you last.